Good afternoon. Now I'm going to talk to you about something that's been talked about a lot already. It's always one of the challenges of going later on in the day is to try and find something new and a new way of saying it. My title is The Power of Knowledge and AI to Transform Customer Experience, which is quite long-winded, but I just want to talk to you about doing knowledge right. So I want to talk to you about what the definition of, or a definition of knowledge, why I believe it's important, and give you some tips about how to do it. As any of you that have been to these sessions previously or previous years know, I like to do a very practical session that gives you kind of hints and tips and things to take away and to be able to implement. So I'm going to start by putting this model up. Now, this is a contact center or typical contact center model, and just talk you through the kind of things that you will all be familiar with in terms of what happens when a customer contacts and speaks to an agent and wants information. The first thing then is that the customer is going to ask a question, and something will happen between the customer asking that question and your agent, whereby they will interpret what they hear the customer say and make a judgment call with regards to what it is that they think the customer wants. Assuming that it's not something that's readily off the top of their head, they're then going to spend some time finding the right answer. And that will involve, first of all, probably finding the document. And as Peter referred to, if that's in SharePoint, that may be, take a little while. They then need to locate the answer in that document. And again, one of the things I've typically seen is kind of you find a document and discover that it's kind of 5 or 6 pages long, so scrolling down through that to find the piece of information that you want. And then you read that information and try and put it into the context of what you've heard the customer say to you and work out what you think that response should be. You then basically interpret that answer and provide that answer back to the customer, who in their turn hears what you say as the agent, puts their own kind of translation onto that and goes away determining what it is that they're going to do. What that often leads to then are a whole host of things that, if you like, are behaviors that impact the performance of the contact center. So things like hold times increasing, customer frustration when they don't feel that the agent has understood what they want, agent frustration in terms of not having the right tools to be able to find the answer quickly, misunderstanding in terms of the translation between the customer and the agent, and all of those things that we are kind of trying to measure and improve in terms of agent satisfaction and customer satisfaction. And I want to break those two things down from a knowledge perspective into, first of all, we'd look at that first element as being findability. And the reason that I asked to talk about this subject is it's one of my huge frustrations. I talked to a number of people who are setting out on a knowledge management journey who seem to think that if we just take all of the content that we've currently got and put it into an eGain system and we do a little bit of search optimization on the top, then suddenly we're going to start achieving all of those great metrics that we've heard you talk about with other clients. And actually, it's not the findability, although that's a key part of reducing things like handling times. The important element is what we would call consumability. So it's the ability to take that piece of information, apply it to the customer problem with kind of context and relevance, and to be able to provide the customer with the answer that they need, and all the information around it that is going to mean that they can solve their problem and not have to call back again. So next, I'm going to consider what knowledge is and how that differs to content. And I'm choosing to do this using an analogy because at this stage in the day, you're all going to be fed up with hearing kind of words and text about knowledge and information. So I've chosen a subject which isn't going to reflect any of your industries, I don't believe, and that is cake making, a subject close to my heart. So let's assume that I, as a relative novice, want to make a cake. And I make my way to the supermarket aisle of my local Waitrose, and I find myself in the baking section. Now, that content in the baking section is well organized. I can find eggs, I can find sugar, I get an awful lot of different choices. But actually, as a novice cake maker, none of that helps me understand what it is I have to do, how I have to put those ingredients together in order to be able to achieve my end result. The content is, however, important. So when we talk about kind of content and knowledge, nobody's saying that actually your content repositories that you currently have are not reusable, are not going to contribute to knowledge. The knowledge, to my mind, then, is the layer that we put on that is going to help you use that to achieve the desired outcome. I was also quite interested speaking to a customer recently who differentiated specifically what they termed information. Now, that's a really broad term, and you could consider that most of your content is information in one way or another. And they were thinking about it in the terms of the way that we might add an FYI to an email. The information is something that might be of interest or of help, but is not something that specifically contributes to you needing to take an action or to do something. So if we think about that, for instance, the information on the back of the egg box that tells you there are 70 calories in a medium-sized egg might be interesting, but makes no difference to my ability to make the cake. And if I was worried about the calories, I probably wouldn't be making the cake in the first place. And the fact that the egg was laid by a hen called Hilda, who's very happy in Hampshire, might make me feel warm and fuzzy, but again doesn't contribute anything to the outcome. So what I really need is the ability to apply that, which is our knowledge. Now, I'm going to use a recipe book as my example here, and clearly there are kind of different levels of knowledge that would help me. If we take the recipe book analogy, that's quite a common one in terms of it'll be a step-by-step process that gets me to an outcome. But it still makes quite a lot of assumptions about my ability as a cake maker. So that's another thing that we need to think about, is that knowledge actually suitable for its intended audience? And as a complete novice, then maybe links to a YouTube channel that are going to show me how do I kind of cream my eggs and sugar together, for instance, might be helpful. So in terms of another layer of knowledge onto that, which is useful for me as a novice, but maybe in 6 months' time I'm not going to need to refer to when a checklist is going to be fine. So actually thinking about what is the appropriate knowledge for the intended audience as well. And the reason that this is important then is the combination of knowledge and the content applied to a specific intent actually will give us our outcome. So clearly I couldn't have just gone and got a packet mix off the baking aisle for something along these lines. Now, a lot of people would stop there, but the other element to it that's really important to think about is the feedback loop. So as Sam alluded to when we were talking about virtual assistant as well, it's not just about kind of building it and putting the information in and letting somebody use it. It's actually having the whole mechanism in place that's going to improve and optimize that over time. So maybe it would be really nice in this particular case with a nice caramel topping on it. Anybody that's ever seen a baking program is going to understand quite how difficult it is to make caramel. So maybe there's a note in the margin of our recipe book that simply says you need to get 2 or 3 times as much sugar as you're expecting because you really ought to start off thinking you might have to do this a couple of times to get it right. Yeah, maybe you're expert bakers and that's not the case. But hopefully you can see where the analogy is going for this. It's actually thinking really carefully about each of those steps and how you can optimize it and how you can make it as easy for the end user as possible. So to put that into a more technical kind of application, we view that sort of AI knowledge systems, there need to be kind of 3 main capabilities that you're thinking about, and kind of reversing those from my previous analogy. The first one is the intent classification. It's about really understanding what it is that your customer is asking of you. Now, that might be the interaction between an agent and a customer on the phone, but clearly what we're attempting to do is to drive them more and more towards digital channels and to be able to self-serve. So that intent classification can be done using kind of machine learning, sort of virtual assistant on the front end, to have that interaction, to understand what it is that the customer wants and to determine what the most appropriate steps are for them. That might be as simple as, here's your answer, but in many cases, it may be more complex than that. So the case-based reasoning, the guided help component that we have, can actually extend that conversation and then help step somebody through a validated business process to get them to the right result. And all of that is underpinned by a governed knowledge base. In a sort of business environment, that's particularly important, that you're ensuring that the information that your customers are given is something that adheres to your policy and procedures and has been signed off. So those 3 things are really important in terms of how you think about building knowledge and how you then take that knowledge and apply that to your business challenges through something like a virtual assistant. Now, talked about an analogy. Hopefully you'll go away and think about it in future in terms of my cake. But then just want to touch on a few practical things learned from a customer that we've been working with recently. So talk a little bit about doing that. The large financial services organisation is in the early stages of implementation, and I was hoping that some of them might come and talk to you today, but hopefully they'll be here next year talking about their successes. But the thing I was really impressed with in talking to them is that their knowledge management team has truly grasped the concept of what we would describe as being knowledge, and they've had some kind of early great results from doing that. So in terms of their approach to defining knowledge, now Sam mentioned about starting with the data, and that's one element of it. They start by pulling together what they call an insight pack, and that is actually learning everything about the particular topic that they're addressing at the time for knowledge. So it might be about payments, for instance, understanding everything they have in their organisation that relates to that. And it might be something like contact stats from their IVR system. It'll be things like who the experts are, what processes they've currently got, what content they've got. They'll speak to people in the contact centre about the typical kind of conversations they have with customers, look at what drives complaints, because that's the other side of it, understanding what happens when it goes wrong. So they bring that insight together into actually then determining what are the questions the customers are asking us, why are we being asked those questions in terms of what's driving it, and what are the optimal answers that we need to be able to provide them with to solve those problems. So it's been mentioned several times again in terms of kind of key lessons. It's about starting with the questions and not starting with the answers that you have. The subsequent knowledge elicitation process is then focused on how do we best answer those questions. And it may well be that you've got much of that information already, that you determine that your documentation or processes in your SharePoint system, for instance, actually provide those answers, and there's nothing wrong then about bringing those across and migrating them into the system. But in a lot of cases, you'll probably find that there are gaps there. There are opportunities to optimize it, to put it much more into kind of customer-facing language, to make it that much more consumable. And then the kind of iteration that I'm talking about is not trying to do too much in one go. Again, another lesson that Sam touched on. So they found that the agile approach has worked really well in terms of building and delivering one topic at a time, testing that, rolling that out, and getting feedback. And interestingly, because they've done that very well, it's also generated a demand. So one of the challenges often with a knowledge management solution is actually getting people to use it effectively when maybe many of them have been doing the job for a few years and believe that they know the answers. So actually being able to generate the demand because they've seen great content and how it's helped them, and to be saying, you know, we'd now like you to focus on this, or we now want this information, and other areas of the business becoming interested, is actually generating a pull for it, is almost kind of guaranteeing success to start off with. The other thing which was really interesting that they talked to me about, and certainly if you talked to me as a consultant about it beforehand, I would have perhaps not played it up as much, is about the team that they brought together to do this. So one of the elements to that is about them being really user-focused. And it wasn't just from one area of the business. What they did was to bring together members into their knowledge management team who represented different areas of the business. So they were from the contact center, from the retail branches. They worked in their digital channels. And what they're then doing is actually being able to bring balanced view of the needs of all of the users. So when they're building their knowledge, they're not just building it for one particular area with the thought that in 6 months they're going to need to start thinking about somebody else. They're actually designing it so it kind of is optimized for the needs of the business from the beginning. And the other element, anybody that's kind of read anything about digital transformation and sort of changes in the industry are going to have heard the word disruptive. And actually, this is something that kind of really came out. So for a large financial services organization, maybe quite staid, quite siloed in some ways, they brought together a team of really creative people who were prepared to challenge the status quo. It wasn't about understanding what the current process was and just building that out. What they would also do is to challenge that process as to whether they were doing it in the best way. So actually what they've also done then is to say to end up with the best knowledge for the customer in a very customer-facing way. So it's being built kind of customer, by sort of customer draw, rather than being driven by what the business wants to tell the customer, which again is a mistake I see people frequently making. So I couldn't get a cake analogy into this one. Proof of the pudding then. They started out by building content for agents, so it's deployed in the contact center. But what they've done is to take some of that content, sort of subset, and actually replace knowledge on their website with some of the knowledge that they've developed for the agents. And just by changing the content, which is an interesting experiment because then it means that the technology hasn't changed, they haven't done anything else, they have seen, for those particular areas, a third increase in people self-serving because it's easier to find, it's easier to use, it's much more kind of relevant and contextual to the customers looking at it. And a reduction of 50% of customers who then read one of those articles and then go on to the Contact Us page with the assumption that at that stage they're either emailing you or they're picking up the phone number to contact you. And that, I think, more than anything, illustrates the power of knowledge done right as opposed to content delivered effectively. So I have actually managed to finish a little bit earlier. We're cracking through this afternoon. You may be glad to know because it's bringing you closer to cocktail hour. So just finished with one last thought. Knowledge, it's a piece of cake. I had to get my kind of pun in here somewhere. And for those of you that don't believe that's the case, feel free to come and have a chat with me afterwards. Again, we've been encouraging you to go and visit the Innovation in 30 Days stand, where we can explain to you how we could take some of your content and deliver that rapidly and prove some of those points to you. All right, thank you very much.